Clara Whitmore slammed her cast-iron pot down on the dirt road so hard it rang like a church bell, and she didn't care who heard it. She had been walking for 6 hours. 6 hours in the summer heat of Montana, carrying everything she owned on her back. A worn leather bag, a change of clothes, a pot, and a cook's knife wrapped in cloth, and every single door she had knocked on in the town of Red Creek had been shut in her face. Not gently, not with apology. Shut hard with eyes that looked her up and down first, and then looked away, as if the sight of her was something to be managed rather than acknowledged. Clara stood in the middle of the road and pressed both hands against her knees and breathed. She was 27 years old. She was large, not the kind of large people politely ignored, but the kind they noticed immediately and never let go of, and she had spent her entire life understanding exactly what that meant in a world that decided a woman's value before she ever opened her mouth. It meant she had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. It meant she had learned to cook better than anyone in any room she had ever entered, because cooking was the one thing nobody could take away from her just by looking at her. It meant she had spent 3 years building a reputation at the Tilden Road boarding house outside Red Creek, cooking 3 meals a day for travelers and workers and drifters, earning every good word said about her, until the owner vanished one Tuesday morning and left nothing behind but locked doors and a note that said the operation was finished. No wages for the final month, no letter of reference, no warning, just gone. And now Clara was standing in the road with the sun beating down and 6 rejections burning in her chest and exactly 4 coins in the pocket of her dress, and she had just slammed her pot on the ground because she needed to hear something that wasn't another door closing. She picked the pot up. She dusted it off. She kept walking. Before this story goes any further, if you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever been judged before, you got the chance to speak. If you've ever had to walk into a room and prove your worth to people who had already decided you didn't have any, this story is for you. Please subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment below and tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Clara Whitmore, because what's coming next is going to change everything. The coal ranch sat 3 miles outside Red Creek along a road that most people in town pretended didn't exist. That was by design. Nathan Cole had not made it easy for people to find him, and that was exactly how he preferred things. He was 38 years old, and he carried the specific kind of silence that comes not from a quiet nature, but from having once been a man who talked and laughed and filled a room, and then losing the reason for all of it. His wife Margaret had died 3 years ago in the spring. She had been sick for a long time before she went, and Nathan had watched it happen the way a man watches a fire burn down to ash. Helpless, sleepless, unable to do anything but stay close and keep his hands from shaking. After she died, the ranch kept going because ranches don't stop for grief. His 7 hands still showed up every morning. The cattle still needed tending. The fences still broke and needed fixing. Life moved forward with an absolute indifference to the fact that everything Nathan had ever cared about was buried in the small cemetery on the hill above the eastern pasture. But the house had died along with Margaret. The kitchen had died. The meals had died. His head cook had left 3 months after the funeral, a kind older woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who told Nathan she couldn't keep working in a place that had stopped eating with any real appetite. She wasn't wrong. Nathan and his men had been managing since then on whatever could be thrown together fast-dried beans, salt pork, hard biscuits that sat in a man's stomach like stones. Nobody complained. But nobody smiled at the table anymore either. Nathan was driving his wagon back from town that afternoon when he came around the bend in the road and saw her. A woman, walking alone, carrying a cast-iron pot in one hand and a leather bag over her other shoulder, moving with the particular kind of determination that meant she was not walking toward something so much as refusing to stop. He slowed the wagon without thinking about it. He had been raised by a mother who would have considered it a personal failing to drive past a woman walking alone on a back road in the Montana heat. "Ma'am," he said, pulling the horse to a stop beside her. Clara stopped walking and looked up at him. She had dark eyes that assessed him quickly and didn't flinch, and the first thing Nathan noticed was not her size, but the fact that she was clearly exhausted and equally clearly not going to admit it. "I'm fine," she said, before he asked. "I didn't say you weren't," Nathan replied. She looked at him for a moment, then at the road ahead, then back at him. "I'm looking for work," she said. "Kitchen work. Do you know anyone in the area hiring?" Nathan considered her. "What kind of kitchen work?" "Cooking." She held up the pot slightly as if he might have missed it. "I cook." "For how many people?" "As many as need feeding." He studied her face. She held his gaze without wavering, and there was something in that, something steady and unperformable that caught his attention. "I've got 7 men," Nathan said. "Hungry ones. My ranch is 3 miles back that way. I haven't had a proper cook in months." Clara didn't move, but something shifted in her posture. "What are the terms?" "Room and board," he said, "and a wage if you earn it." "What does earning it look like?" Nathan looked at her, then at the pot, then back at her face. "Cook me one good meal tonight," he said. "If my men sit down at that table and believe there's somewhere worth being, you stay." It wasn't kindness. He didn't offer it as kindness. It was a transaction plain and direct, and Clara recognized it immediately for what it was, which was the fairest offer she had received all day. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated and nodded toward the back of the wagon. Clara climbed up with her pot and her bag and her 4 coins and her exhaustion, and Nathan Cole turned the wagon around and drove back toward a ranch that didn't know yet how badly it needed her. The kitchen at the Cole ranch was a disgrace. Clara walked in and stopped in the doorway and took one long look at the state of it, and she did not say a single word about what she saw. She asked Nathan 2 questions. "Where's your pantry?" "Back left," he said. "Do you have a garden?" He paused. "There was one, behind the house. My wife kept it. Nobody's touched it since she passed." Clara nodded once. "I'll need to see both." She went to the pantry first. It was not empty, but it was not far from it. Dried pinto beans. A sack of flour that had seen better days. Salt pork wrapped in cloth. A half-empty tin of lard. 3 jars of preserved tomatoes pushed to the back of a shelf as if someone had forgotten them. A string of dried chilies hanging from a nail near the ceiling. Clara stood in the pantry for a long moment. In her mind, she was already building the meal the way she always did, not from recipes, but from instinct, from years of understanding what hungry people actually needed versus what they thought they wanted. They didn't want fancy. They wanted real. They wanted something that tasted like a decision had been made about them, that someone had cared enough to make something, not just produce it. She went out the back door to the garden. It was overgrown and largely dead the way a garden goes when it loses the person who loved it. But she walked along the edges and crouched down in 3 different spots, and she found what she was looking for, wild sage growing stubborn at the corner of a rotted fence post, and a few thyme plants that had survived on sheer spite, and a small patch of green onion that had reseeded itself without permission. She cut what she needed with her knife. She went back inside. She built a fire in the kitchen stove and tied her apron strings behind her back and went to work. The ranch hands came in at 6 o'clock. There were 7 of them, Hale, who was oldest and had been with Nathan the longest. Diego, who was quiet and fast and watched everything. Young Emmett, who was 19 and still had the habit of looking at the table before he sat down, checking whether there was anything worth sitting down for. And 4 others whose names Clara didn't have yet, but whose faces she read immediately tired, hungry, not expecting much. They came in and they smelled it before they saw anything. The stew had been going for 2 hours, pinto beans slow cooked with the salt pork broken down into it until the broth was thick and dark and rich, seasoned with the dried chilies and the thyme and the sage, and the whole kitchen held the smell the way a coat holds warmth. Emmett stopped in the doorway. "What in the—" he started. "Sit down," Clara said without turning from the stove. "Biscuits are coming off in 2 minutes." There was a brief silence behind her. Then the sound of boots on floorboards and chairs scraping back from the table. She brought the pot to the table herself, heavy both hands on the handle, and set it in the center, and then went back for the biscuits, which were golden, and had risen properly, despite the flour being older than they deserved. She set everything down and stepped back and said nothing. Hale was the first to serve himself. He ladled the stew into his bowl and picked up a biscuit and tore it and let the steam out. And then he ate a spoonful, and he didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "Lord Almighty." That was all he said. But Diego looked up from his bowl at Clara with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was something deeper recognition maybe. Like a man who had almost forgotten what he was looking for and had just been reminded. Young Emmett ate his first bowl so fast Clara was already moving to refill it before he'd set his spoon down. "Ma'am," he said, looking up at her with something close to reverence. "This is the best thing I've eaten since my mama's kitchen." "Don't talk with your mouth full," Clara said. Emmett laughed. It was the first laugh that had been heard in that kitchen in quite some time, and it seemed to surprise the room slightly, the way a sound will when a place has forgotten it's allowed to make it. Nathan sat at the head of the table. He ate without speaking, which Clara had already noted was his default, not rudeness, just how he organized himself. He ate the stew and the biscuit and then sat back slightly and looked at his men. And Clara watched him watching them from the corner of her eye as she moved around the kitchen. He was seeing something. She could tell because his face, which was not an expressive face, shifted in a way that was small but real, something behind the eyes that hadn't been there before he sat down. He took a second serving, then he set down his spoon and he looked at Clara directly. "You can stay," he said. It was the same 3 words he had offered as a condition on the road, but they meant something different now, and both of them knew it. Clara nodded, because she trusted herself to do that without the back of her throat tightening, and she went back to the stove. She was washing the dishes when she heard Boots stop in the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn around. She knew from the weight of the step that it was Nathan. "There's a room above the barn," he said. "It's not much, but it's clean." "That's fine," Clara said. A pause. "You worked at the Tilden Road place," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara stopped scrubbing. "You heard of it?" "I heard Tilden pulled out without paying his workers." "He did." Another pause. She heard him shift his weight. "That's a rotten thing," Nathan said. "Yes." Clara agreed. It was. She went back to scrubbing. She heard him start to leave and then stop. "The men liked the meal," he said, like he was reporting something factual, not offering a compliment. Clara almost smiled. "I know." She heard him leave. She stood at the sink in the dark kitchen with the sounds of the ranch settling around her, the cattle in the far pasture, the wind off the mountains, the muffled voices of the men in the bunkhouse, and she let herself feel it, the loosening of something that had been pulled very tight for a very long time. She had a kitchen. She had a roof. She had earned exactly what she had promised. That was enough. For tonight, that was everything. The next morning, Clara was up before dawn. She had slept more deeply than she expected in the small room above the barn. It was plain and dusty, and the window faced east, so the first light came in directly. But the cot was solid, and the blanket was thick, and she had fallen asleep almost before she finished the thought of lying down. She built the fire in the kitchen stove at 4:30. By the time the men stirred at 5, there was coffee ready, which was not something they had been accustomed to having in the morning, and the smell of it alone pulled Emmett in with his boots still unlaced, moving toward it with the single-minded focus of a man who has not had a reason to get up early in a long time. "You're up before us," he said, blinking. "Coffee's on," Clara told him. "You made coffee," he said, as if this were a remarkable event requiring documentation. "I did. Every morning." "Every morning I'm here," Clara said. Emmett looked at her for a moment with an expression she had seen before, the particular look of a young man who has just decided something firmly. Then he said, "Well, I'm going to be here every morning then," and poured his cup. Hale came in next and stopped at the sight of the coffee, the same way a man stops at the sight of unexpected good news. He poured himself a cup and drank it standing up and said nothing, and didn't need to. Nathan came in last. He was dressed for a full day's work, already hat on jacket, fastened against the morning cold, and he paused when he came through the kitchen door and saw the stove going, and the coffee ready, and Clara at the counter cutting salt pork for breakfast, and something happened in his face that was brief and almost invisible. Almost. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," Clara replied. He poured his coffee and stood at the far end of the counter and drank it in silence, the way he did, everything contained self-sufficient, as if he had learned to take up exactly the minimum necessary amount of space. "You'll need a full account of what's in the pantry," he said eventually. "I already took it last night." He looked at her. "There are gaps," Clara continued. "I can make a list of what's needed. If you're going into town." "I go Thursdays." "Then I'll have a list ready by Wednesday night." He held his coffee cup with both hands and looked at her the way he had on the road, that same careful measuring look that was not unkind, but was not giving anything away either. "What else?" he said. Clara hesitated for only a moment. "The garden," she said. "The one behind the house." His expression didn't change, but something stiffened slightly in his posture. "What about it?" he said. "With some work it could produce again, if you'd allow it. It would save money, and the meals would be better for it." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "That garden was my wife's," he said. "It came out flat informational, but the flatness itself was the information." "I know," Clara said, and she kept her voice even and steady. "And I won't do anything with it that you don't want done. But if there's any part of it you'd like to see grow again, say the word, and I'll tend it." He looked out the kitchen window in the direction of the back garden, which they could not see from where they were standing. He didn't answer. Clara didn't push. She went back to the salt pork. After a moment, Nathan set his empty cup on the counter and walked out of the kitchen, and Clara heard the door to the yard close behind him. She kept working. She had been doing this her whole life, working in the silence, left by people who weren't ready to say what they meant yet. She had learned that the best thing you could do in those silences was simply keep working, keep cooking, keep making the thing real and warm and present, so that when the person was finally ready, there was something solid waiting for them. She got the breakfast on. She did not think about Margaret Cole's garden any further that morning, but when she went out the back door an hour later to throw the dishwater, she saw fresh boot prints in the wet grass near the garden gate, and she understood that Nathan Cole had gone to look at it. He hadn't said yes, but he hadn't said no. And Clara Whitmore had spent 27 years learning the difference between a closed door and a door that was simply waiting to be opened from the inside. She went back into the kitchen. She had a ranch to feed. The week passed in a rhythm Clara found steadying. Morning fire, coffee, breakfast, the men out to their work, the kitchen hers to organize and clean and think in, midday meal packed and carried out or eaten fast by whoever came in, the long afternoon stretch when she worked on the deeper things, the inventory, the planning, the slow building of a kitchen that actually functioned rather than merely survived. She fixed the pantry shelves that had warped. She found a wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth behind a box of tools that someone had apparently forgotten existed, and she incorporated it carefully into 3 separate meals. She made soup from bones Nathan had been throwing to the barn cats, and the resulting broth was the foundation of a meal that made Old Hale go back for thirds, and then sit with his hands folded on the table for a quiet moment before standing up. "My mother made soup like that," he said to no one in particular. Clara said nothing because it didn't need a response. What she was doing and what she understood she was doing was not simply cooking. She was restoring something. Every meal was a vote cast in favor of the idea that this place was worth caring about, that the people who lived and worked here were worth feeding, well worth the extra hour it took to do something right instead of just adequate. The men felt it, not consciously, maybe not in a way they would have been able to name. But it showed in small things. In the way they came to the table faster than they used to. In the way Emmett had started washing his hands without being reminded. In the way Diego, who rarely spoke, began leaving brief, small items on the kitchen counter. A bundle of wild mint he'd found near the creek, a handful of late-season berries, a sprig of something Clara didn't immediately identify, but turned out to be wild rosemary. He never said anything when he left them. Clara never said anything when she found them. But she used every one. Nathan watched all of this. From a distance, the way he watched most things, not cold, but cautious. Like a man standing at the edge of something he isn't yet sure will hold his weight. Clara watched him, watching the way she always watched from the corner of her eye while her hands were busy. She had been in kitchens her whole life. She had fed people who were hungry and lonely and ashamed of both, and she knew what it looked like when a person was starving for something they didn't have words for yet. Nathan Cole wasn't just hungry for a decent meal. He was hungry for the feeling that his home was still alive. She couldn't fix what had happened to him. She couldn't undo 3 years of grief, or replace what he had lost, or tell him that the weight he carried wasn't as heavy as it felt. But she could cook his meals, and keep his kitchen clean, and make sure that every morning when his men walked through that door, there was something warm waiting, and she could tend the place with the care it deserved, and she could be steady in a way that didn't ask anything from him. That was what she could do, so that was what she did. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after her arrival, that the first real trouble showed up. Clara was in the kitchen making bread when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Not Nathan's wagon, a different sound, heavier and faster, and then voices in the yard, and then Nathan's voice, which she had already learned to read with a fair degree of accuracy. Tight, controlled, not happy. She didn't go to the window, but she listened. She heard the visitor's voice before she could make out the words. A smooth voice, the kind that had been trained to be agreeable with a warmth in it that sat on the surface and went no further. She had cooked for enough men in her life to know the difference between a warm voice and a warm man. She kept working the bread dough. The voices moved around to the side of the house, and she lost them for a time, and then Nathan came into the kitchen alone. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. "Who's that?" Clara asked. "Charles Whitaker," Nathan said. "Land investor out of Billings." Clara's hands stilled on the dough. "Whitaker," she said. "You know him?" She thought for a moment about how to answer that. "I've heard the name," she said. "The boarding house where I worked, the owner Tilden, he had dealings with a Whitaker out of Billings, a few months before he disappeared." Nathan was very still in the doorway. "What kind of dealings?" he said. Clara shaped the bread and set it to rest and wiped her hands on her apron before she turned to face him. "The kind that ended with the boarding house locked and the workers unpaid," she said, "and Tilden gone, and a man from Billings who was never mentioned by name in any of it, but who several people in town believe acquired the property for about a quarter of what it was worth." The silence in the kitchen was very complete. Nathan's jaw was set in a way she was becoming familiar with the expression he wore when something had confirmed a thing he already suspected but had been hoping he was wrong about. "He wants to buy the ranch," Nathan said. "Or he wants me to believe he's buying it out of goodwill because he's concerned about the territory's struggling ranchers." "What's his offer?" Nathan told her the number. Clara looked at him. "That's less than the value of your cattle alone," she said. "I know what it is." "Did you tell him that?" "I told him I'd think on it." Clara turned back to the bread. "Don't think too long," she said. "Men like that, the longer you leave them waiting, the more they move around to the other side of whatever you're protecting." She said it quietly, without drama, the same way she said most things, and she heard Nathan exhale slowly behind her. "He'll be coming back," Nathan said. "I know," Clara replied. "He'll hear you're here, and he'll hear things about you. He'll try to use whatever he can." Clara's hands were steady on the bread pan. "Let him try," she said. There was a pause. Then Nathan said very quietly, "You don't scare easy, do you, Miss Whitmore?" Clara set the bread pan down. She turned and looked at Nathan Cole directly, and there was something in her expression that wasn't defiance and wasn't bravado. It was simply the look of a woman who had been frightened many times in her life, and had learned that being frightened and being stopped were not the same thing. "I scare," she said. "I just don't stop." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once the small firm nod he used instead of most words, and he walked back out to his yard, and Clara heard him call something to his men in a voice that had found its authority again, and she stood in the kitchen with her hands on the edge of the counter and breathed. The bread was rising. The stove was warm. Outside, the Montana afternoon was moving toward evening, and somewhere in the middle distance, a man named Charles Whitaker was driving back toward town with plans Clara hadn't heard yet and intentions Nathan hadn't agreed to. But she was here. She had a kitchen and a cast-iron pot and 27 years of knowing exactly what it took to keep something alive when everything around it was trying to let it die. And Clara Whitmore had never once walked away from a kitchen that needed her. She wasn't about to start now. Charles Whitaker came back on a Saturday. Clara heard the wagon before she saw it, the same heavy sound from Thursday moving faster than it needed to on a ranch road, the kind of speed that announced itself on purpose. She was at the kitchen window wringing out a dishcloth when the wagon came through the gate, and she watched Whitaker climb down from the seat with the particular ease of a man who believed every place he entered was already in some sense his. He was well dressed for a ranch visit. That was the first thing. A good coat, clean boots, hat at a careful angle. He carried himself the way men carry themselves when they have spent a long time practicing the impression they make on arrival. Clara watched him cross the yard toward Nathan, who had come out of the barn and was standing with his arms at his sides in the posture she now recognized as his version of braced. She went back to the dishes. She could hear the voices through the window, not the words, not yet, but the shape of the conversation. Whitaker's voice doing most of the work. Nathan's voice shorter, harder at the edges. The rhythm of a man being sold something he hadn't asked for. Then she heard her name. Not clearly, not completely, but the shape of it. Whitmore, and the shift in Whitaker's tone when he said it. A drop in warmth. A pointed thing inside a polite sentence. Clara set the dish she was holding down carefully and dried her hands. She walked to the back door, opened it, and stepped out into the yard. Both men looked at her. Whitaker's expression moved through several things very quickly. Surprise, assessment, and then a rearrangement into something that tried to look like pleasantry. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim. "Mr. Whitaker," Clara said. He blinked. Hadn't expected to be known. "You have me at a disadvantage," he said with a smile that didn't reach anything behind it. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "I cook here." "Ah." The smile adjusted slightly. "Well, Miss Whitmore, I was just having a conversation with Mr. Cole about the future of this property." "I know," Clara said. "I could hear the shape of it from the kitchen." Whitaker glanced at Nathan, then back at her. The pleasantry was still there, but it had gotten a little thinner. "This is a business matter," he said, "between Mr. Cole and myself. Most business matters that involve this ranch become kitchen matters eventually," Clara said. "Because this is where the men who work this land eat and rest and talk about whether they're staying or leaving. So I have some interest in how the business turns out." Whitaker was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed a real laugh, slightly surprised out of him, and he looked at Nathan with the expression of a man recalibrating. "She's direct," Whitaker said. "She is," Nathan agreed. His voice was flat, but Clara caught something in it, something that wasn't displeasure. "Mr. Whitaker," Clara said, "I worked at the Tilden Road boarding house for 3 years before it closed. Perhaps you've heard of it." The smile didn't disappear, but it changed character entirely. "I believe I may have heard the name," Whitaker said carefully. "I believe you may have done more than that," Clara said. "But I'm not here to make accusations. I'm here to make lunch. If you'd like to stay, you're welcome at the table. Mr. Cole runs a generous house." She looked at Nathan as she said it, and Nathan looked back at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something that was not quite surprised and not quite amused, and was entirely something else she didn't have a name for yet. "I'll pass on lunch," Whitaker said. His voice had found a new temperature. "But I appreciate the offer." He turned back to Nathan. "Think on the offer, Cole. It's a fair one. Fairer than the alternative. What's the alternative? Nathan said. Whitaker smiled, and this time it was thinner than anything. Markets change, he said. Droughts happen. Cattle prices drop. A man who waits too long to sell smart sometimes ends up selling desperate. He touched his hat brim again. Looked once more at Clara with an expression she had seen on other men. Not anger, not yet, but the specific look of someone storing information for later use. Then he climbed back up to his wagon and drove out. The yard was quiet. Nathan stood watching the gate for a moment after the wagon disappeared, and Clara stood a few feet away and let him have that moment without filling it. Then he said without turning, "You shouldn't have come out." "You're right," Clara said. "I shouldn't have. I did anyway." A pause. "He'll use it," Nathan said. "He'll say I've got a woman running my affairs. He'll use it with the other ranchers." "He was already going to say something about me," Clara said. "I saw it in his face when he heard my name. Whatever he's planning to do, he planned it before I stepped out that door. I just wanted him to know that I knew." Nathan finally turned and looked at her. "Why?" he said. Clara met his eyes. "Because men like that depend on people not knowing," she said. "The moment they understand that you've already seen them clearly, they have to work harder, and men who have to work harder make mistakes." Nathan studied her for a long time. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "From watching what happened to every woman I've ever known who waited for someone else to protect her," Clara said. And she went back inside to make lunch. The trouble came in 3 stages, the way serious trouble usually does. The first stage was talk. Clara heard it when she went into Red Creek with Nathan on Thursday to help carry supplies. She heard it in the way conversations shifted when she entered the general store. Not stopping, not obvious, but changing direction, the way a creek changes direction when something falls into it. She heard the word cook used in a tone that made it mean something else. She heard a woman behind a bolt of fabric say to no one in particular that it was a strange arrangement. A single man and a woman like that on a ranch out of town, and you had to wonder what the real nature of it was. Clara picked up a sack of dried corn and moved to the next item on her list. She did not turn around. She did not give them the satisfaction of her face, but she heard it, and she filed it away because the shape of what was coming was becoming clearer, and she needed to understand it fully before she could decide what to do about it. Nathan was at the far end of the store talking to another rancher, a broad-shouldered man named Garrett Moss, who ran cattle on the north side of the valley. Clara watched Nathan's face from a distance while she moved through her list, and she saw the moment it happened, the moment Moss said something that made Nathan's expression flatten in a particular way. On the wagon ride back, Nathan was quiet for longer than usual. Clara waited. They were 2 miles out of town before he spoke. "Moss told me Whitaker's been talking," Nathan said. "I expected that," Clara said. "He's saying I hired a woman nobody in town would vouch for, that she's been run out of other places, that she has a history of—" He stopped. "Of what?" Clara said. Nathan's jaw was tight. "Of attaching herself to situations where she's not wanted and being difficult to remove." The words landed with a specific weight. Clara looked at her hands in her lap. "That's a creative way to describe a woman who refuses to be mistreated," she said. "I know what it is," Nathan said, and his voice had something in it that surprised her. Not anger at her, but anger on her behalf, and those were very different things. "Do you believe him?" Clara asked. The question sat in the air between them. Nathan turned and looked at her directly, which he rarely did when he was driving. "No," he said. Just that. One word. But he said it the way he said most important things, quietly and without decoration, which was how she had come to understand that he meant something absolutely. Clara looked back at the road ahead. "Then we don't need to talk about it any further," she said. But they both knew it was not finished. Tud. The second stage arrived the following Monday, and it did not come gently. Clara was at the stove when she heard the commotion in the yard. Not a fight, not yet, but the precursor to one voice is raised, and something scraped across the ground. She looked out and saw two men she didn't recognize standing near the bunkhouse, and Diego and Emmett facing them, with the posture of men who were deciding whether the next 30 seconds were going to be controlled or not. She dried her hands. She walked outside. The two men were laborers of some kind, hired men, the look of them unfamiliar to the ranch, but familiar to Clara in a general way. They had the particular blankness of men being used as instruments for someone else's purpose. One of them was holding a folded paper which he'd apparently just handed to Diego. "What is this?" Diego said, not to the men, but to Clara, because she had walked up beside him. She took the paper and unfolded it. It was a notice. Unofficial, not stamped, but the language was legal sounding in the way documents are written by people who want them to be intimidating without being official. It cited an unnamed complaint about the sanitary conditions of a food preparation establishment operating on the coal ranch. It suggested that the preparation and distribution of food by an unlicensed, unvetted individual constituted a potential hazard. It recommended that said individual cease food preparation activities pending a review by the county board. It was not signed. It was not real. But it was exactly designed to look close enough to real that a man who didn't read carefully might panic. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it. "Tell whoever sent you," she said to the two men, "that this paper has no seal, no signature, and no legal standing. And tell them that I will be writing a letter to the actual county board this week to inform them that documents of this nature are being circulated falsely under their implied authority. And tell them that the woman who sent this letter knows the name of the man who paid you to deliver it." The two men looked at each other. "Ma'am," one started. "You've delivered your paper," Clara said. "You can go." They went. Emmett turned to her with his mouth slightly open. "Do you actually know who sent it?" he said. "I have a strong opinion," Clara said. "And the county board letter?" "I will write that letter this afternoon," Clara said, "because it is the right thing to do, and because it will irritate Mr. Whitaker considerably when he finds out." Emmett made a sound that was half laugh and half something like awe. Diego took the folded notice from Clara's hand, looked at it once more, and put it in his jacket pocket. "For the record," he said quietly. He said it the way Diego said everything, with enormous efficiency and complete seriousness. Clara nodded and went back to the kitchen. She sat down at the kitchen table for a moment before she picked up her pen because she needed that moment. Not because she was frightened she had told Nathan the truth about that, but because she was human, and the effort of being unshaken was still an effort, and it cost something even when it worked. She breathed. She picked up the pen. She wrote the letter. Nathan found out about the notice that evening from Hale, not from Clara. She knew he found out because she heard his voice from the bunkhouse carry through the kitchen window with an edge she hadn't heard from him before, not loud, but with a heat underneath it that the quiet couldn't quite contain. He came into the kitchen 20 minutes later. Clara was at the table writing a list. She looked up. His face was doing several things at once, none of them small. "You should have told me," he said. "I handled it," Clara said. "I know you handled it. That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Nathan said, and he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down in it, which was unusual enough that she put her pen down. "Is that this is my ranch, and when someone sends false notices to my ranch designed to remove my cook, that is something I need to know about." Clara looked at him. "I didn't want to bother you with it," she said. "That's not—" Nathan stopped, set his hat on the table, ran one hand through his hair in the way he did when he was choosing words carefully. "Clara, you have been here 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, you have rebuilt this kitchen. You have fed these men better than they have been fed in 3 years. You have written a letter to the county board that I guarantee you Whitaker did not anticipate, and you handled 2 of his hired men in my yard without raising your voice, and you were going to not bother me with it." There was a long pause. "Yes," Clara said. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Because I have spent my whole life trying not to be a problem for the people who were kind enough to let me be somewhere, she said. It's a hard habit to break. The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. It was heavier, and it had something in it she couldn't read, which was unusual because she had become fairly good at reading Nathan Cole's silences. You are not a problem, he said. And the way he said it was not gentle exactly, but it had a firmness in it that was something better than gentle. It was certain. You are the reason my men showed up to breakfast this morning without being reminded. You are the reason Emmett stopped eating like he's got somewhere else to be. You are the reason this kitchen smells like something worth coming home to. That is not a problem. That is the opposite of a problem. Clara looked at the table. She was not going to let her eyes do anything embarrassing. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me, Nathan said. Just tell me things. She looked up at him. Tell you things, she repeated. When something happens on this ranch that I should know about. He said, tell me. You don't have to handle everything alone. You have been doing that long enough already, I think. Clara held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. All right, he said. He picked his hat up from the table. He started to stand, and then he paused. The letter you wrote to the county board, he said. I mailed it today when we sent Emmett into town. Nathan almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen from him, a shift at the corner of his mouth that lasted about 1 second and then was gone. Good, he said, and he left. Clara sat at the table for a moment after he was gone. She picked up her pen. She was not entirely sure what had just happened, only that it was something, and that the something had left a warmth in the room that the stove alone hadn't produced. She went back to her list. Whammed. The third stage of the trouble arrived in a way Clara hadn't anticipated, which meant it was the most dangerous. She was working in the neglected garden behind the house Nathan had given his wordless permission, by not objecting when she mentioned it again, and she had taken that as her answer when she heard a horse approaching and looked up to find a woman she didn't recognize coming through the rear gate. The woman was roughly Clara's age, well dressed in a way that was not showy but was deliberate, and she had the composed face of someone who had practiced being composed in public for a long time. Miss Whitmore, the woman said. Yes, Clara said. She stood up from where she'd been kneeling. My name is Eleanor Voss, the woman said. My husband is Gerald Voss. He owns the Voss timber operation on the North Road. Clara waited. I've come as a courtesy, Eleanor said. Not as an enemy. All right, Clara said. Charles Whitaker had dinner at our home last week, Eleanor said. He spoke about Mr. Cole's ranch at some length. He spoke about you. I'd imagine he did, Clara said. Eleanor looked at her steadily. He said you are a woman with no character references, no provable history, and an inappropriate influence over a grieving widower. Clara kept her face still. He said further, Eleanor continued, that the arrangement on this ranch is one that decent women in the valley should be concerned about, and that he hoped the community would make its feelings known in a manner that would encourage Mr. Cole to make better decisions. And what do decent women in the valley think? Clara asked. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Most of them think what they are told to think by their husbands, she said. And their husbands are being told what to think by Charles Whitaker, who holds paper on several of their operations. Clara looked at her. But not yours, Clara said. Something in Eleanor's face shifted. Not mine, she agreed. Gerald Voss owes Whitaker nothing, which is why I am able to come here and tell you what I am telling you. Clara pulled off her garden gloves and held them in both hands. What exactly are you telling me, Mrs. Voss? She said. That Whitaker is not going to stop, Eleanor said simply. He wants this land. He has decided that you are the easiest thing to remove, and he is building a social pressure that he believes will make Nathan Cole choose between keeping you here and being accepted by his community. The words were plain and calm, and they landed like stones dropped into deep water. Why are you warning me? Clara said. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Because I was you once, she said. Not exactly, but something close enough. A woman who came to a place where she had no standing and was told in every way possible that she didn't belong there. And the only difference between how it ended for me and how it might end for you is that someone told me the shape of what was coming before it arrived. Clara held the woman's gaze. Thank you, she said. Truly. Eleanor nodded once with the economy of someone who had not come to be thanked but accepted it anyway. One more thing, Eleanor said, and something in her tone changed, dropped down slightly into something harder and more private. Nathan Cole was a good man before he lost Margaret. He is still a good man. He is simply a man who has forgotten how to believe that things can be all right again. She paused. Don't let Whitaker take this from him. He has lost enough. She didn't wait for a response. She turned her horse and rode back out the rear gate, and Clara stood in the dead garden with her gloves in her hands and the afternoon sun on the back of her neck, and she breathed. The shape of what was coming was fully clear now. Whitaker was going to make Nathan choose. And the question that mattered, the one Clara had to answer before Nathan did, was what she was willing to do to make sure the choice Nathan made was his own, and not something that had been manufactured for him by a man with dishonest intentions and too much leverage. She put her gloves back on. She went back to work on the garden. She pulled up dead stalks and loosened the soil around what was still alive under the surface, and she turned the dirt and worked it the way she worked every hard thing, methodically, patiently, without panic, because the panic didn't help anything grow. But her mind was working alongside her hands, and by the time she went back inside to start the evening meal, she had the beginning of something. Not a plan, not yet, but a direction. That night, after the men had eaten, and the kitchen had been cleaned, and the ranch had settled into the sounds it made. At the end of a day, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and a piece of paper and started writing down everything she knew. Not feelings, facts. The date Tilden's boarding house had closed. The month Clara had been there. The name of the county record office where property transfers were filed. The question of who had acquired the Tilden Road property after the closure and when and for how much. The names of the other ranch owners in the valley who were, according to Eleanor Voss's careful phrasing, in a position where they owed Whitaker something. She wrote for an hour. Then she sat back and looked at what she had. It was not enough. Not yet. But it was a map of sorts, the shape of something that could become enough if she found the right details in the right places. She was still sitting there when the kitchen door opened and Nathan came in. He stopped when he saw her. "You're up late," he said. "Thinking," she said. He poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher on the counter and leaned against the far wall and looked at her across the kitchen. "About Whitaker," he said. It wasn't a question. "About the land records office in Red Creek," Clara said. "Who has access to property transfer filings?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. "County clerk. Name's Dorset. Why?" "Because if Whitaker acquired the Tilden property through the same methods he's trying to use on your ranch," Clara said, "there will be a paper trail. Men who do things through pressure and manipulation still have to sign things eventually, and signed things leave records." Nathan looked at her. "You're thinking about fighting him on paper," he said. "I'm thinking that the only way to stop a man who uses documents falsely is to find the real documents," Clara said. "The ones he can't deny and can't disappear." The lamp between them flickered slightly in a draft from the window. "Clara," Nathan said. Something in his tone made her look up. "This could make things harder before they get easier," he said. "I know," she said. "He has connections in this valley that I don't. I know that too. If we go looking at county records and word gets back to him, and it will, he's going to accelerate whatever he's planning." "Yes," Clara said. "He is." Nathan set his water cup down on the counter. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the yard after Whitaker's first visit, and in the wagon after the conversation with Moss, and at the kitchen table, After the false notice, that same look, each time slightly less guarded than the time before, as if something was being adjusted incrementally behind it. "What do you need?" he said. Clara looked back at her paper. "Thursday," she said, "and a reason to spend a little longer in town than usual." Nathan nodded. "I'll need to speak with Dorset about a fence survey anyway," he said. "That'll take time." He said it completely evenly, as if this were a practical arrangement and nothing more. Which was exactly how he handled most things that mattered, and which was Clara was beginning to understand one of the truest things about him. "Thank you," she said. "Get some sleep," he said. He walked out of the kitchen, and Clara listened to his boots on the floorboard until they were gone. She looked at her list. She thought about what Eleanor Voss had said and what it meant, and how many things in this world were held in place, not by their actual weight, but by the number of people who had simply decided not to look at them too carefully. She blew out the lamp. In the dark kitchen, with the ranch quiet all around her, Clara Whitmore made herself a quiet and private promise. She had come here with a cast-iron pot and 4 coins and nothing else. She had built something here, not just meals, but the thing underneath meals, the feeling that this place was alive and worth being alive in. And she was not going to let a man who specialized in taking things from people who had already lost too much walk away with this one. Not this kitchen. Not this ranch. Not these people. She had been run off before, talked down before, dismissed and underestimated and overlooked, and made to feel that her size was the most important thing about her, since she was old enough to understand what people were saying when they said it. She was done with being the woman who disappeared when it got hard. She folded her list. She put it in her apron pocket. She went upstairs to the small room above the barn, where her cast-iron pot sat on the floor beside her bed, like the only truly loyal thing she'd ever owned, and she lay down, and she slept. Thursday came, the way important days always do in Clara's experience, looking exactly like every other day until it didn't. She was up at 4:30, fire in the stove by 4:45. Coffee ready before the men stirred the way they had come to expect it now, the way Emmett had once told her, with complete sincerity, that he didn't entirely believe mornings existed before she had started making them real. She packed the breakfast fast and clean. Salt pork fried cornmeal cakes, the last of the preserves from the 3 jars she'd found, pushed to the back of the pantry when she arrived. She moved through the kitchen with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been cooking under pressure her whole life, and had long since stopped needing to think about the mechanics of it. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. The list in her apron pocket had been rewritten twice since the night she'd first made it. It was tighter now, more specific. Names, dates, the particular questions she needed the county land records to answer. She had not been to the Red Creek clerk's office before, but she had spent enough years listening to men talk about business in the dining rooms and boarding houses where she'd worked to understand how property transfers were filed and what a fraudulent one might look like versus a clean one. She wasn't a lawyer, but she was a woman who paid attention, and in her experience, that had proven to be worth considerably more than any certificate. Nathan came into the kitchen at 5:15. He poured his coffee and stood at the counter and looked at her. And she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because neither of them needed to. "Dorset's office opens at 8, Nathan said. "I know," Clara said. "We should leave by 6:30 to make the supply run first and still have time." "I'll be ready." He drank his coffee. She plated the breakfast. When the men filed in, Hale looked at the preserves and then at Clara and said, "Last of the good jars," with the tone of a man asking after an old friend. "Last of those," Clara said. "But there's enough in the garden now that I can put up new ones before the end of the month." Haley nodded with the solemn satisfaction of a man who has just been told that the world will in fact continue. Diego ate without speaking as usual, but when he finished, he folded his napkin in a careful square and set it precisely next to his plate. Something Clara had noticed. He only did on mornings when he was, for reasons his face would never explain, particularly content. Emmett talked through the entire meal as usual, which this morning included a detailed account of a dream he'd had involving a horse that could play cards, and a sheriff who was also a blacksmith, and which Clara listened to with half her attention and found oddly soothing. Normal, she thought. All of it still normal. She held on to that. The wagon ride into Red Creek took 40 minutes on a clear road, and Nathan drove it the way he drove. Most things steady. No wasted movement. Attention distributed evenly between the road ahead and the surrounding landscape in the automatic way of a man who had spent his life reading terrain. They were about halfway there when he said without preamble, "Whitaker is expecting me to fold." Clara looked at the road ahead. "I know," she said. "He's made that offer to at least 3 other ranchers in the valley in the last 2 years," Nathan said. 2 of them took it. One of them held out, and then had a fence line dispute that went legal and cost him more than the sale would have. "The fence line dispute," Clara said. "Was that a coincidence?" No one could prove it wasn't. "But you don't think it was?" "No," Nathan said. "I don't." A pause. "So he has a pattern," Clara said. "A clear one. And the ranchers who sold to him, do they still know what they lost?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Garrett Moss does," he said. "His brother took the deal 2 years back on the north parcel. Moss watched that land get stripped of cattle and resold to a rail interest inside of 8 months for 4 times what Whitaker paid." Clara turned that over. "Moss told you this?" "Moss told me this the same day he told me Whitaker was talking about you in town," Nathan said. "I didn't put those 2 things together until later." Clara looked at him. "Moss was warning you," she said. Obliquely. "Would he be willing to be less oblique?" Nathan's hands adjusted slightly on the reins. "That," he said, "is the right question." They drove the rest of the way into Red Creek without speaking, but it was the silence of 2 people thinking in the same direction, which was an entirely different thing from the silence of 2 people with nothing to say to each other, and Clara was beginning to understand the difference very well. The county clerk's office was at the back of a narrow building that also housed the post office, and for reasons never adequately explained, a small collection of surveying equipment that appeared to have been there since approximately the founding of the territory. The clerk, Dorset, was a man of about 50 with careful eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the permanently ink-stained fingers of someone who had been keeping records for a very long time and took that responsibility with great seriousness. Nathan introduced Clara simply as the cook from the coal ranch without elaboration, and Dorset accepted this without visible reaction, which she appreciated. Nathan explained the fence survey business, which was real, and took approximately 15 minutes to sort out, and during which Clara sat in the chair near the door and waited with her hands folded and her mind focused. When Nathan finished, and Dorset turned to file the relevant papers, Clara said, "Mr. Dorset, while we're here, might I ask about the process for reviewing past property transfer records? For the Valley area, say in the last 3 years." Dorset turned back. He looked at her over his spectacles. "Public record," he said. "Anyone can review. What are you looking for?" "The Tilden Road boarding house," Clara said. "I worked there before it closed. I'm trying to understand what happened to the property after closure." Dorset's expression didn't change in a way most people would notice, but Clara was watching for something specific, and she found it a very small tightening around the eyes that wasn't suspicion of her, but recognition of the name. "Tilden Road," he said, and said it carefully. "Yes," Clara said. Dorset looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at him steadily. "Give me a few minutes," Dorset said. He went into the back room. He was gone for 8 minutes. Clara counted. When he came back, he had a folder of papers, and he laid them on the counter with the methodical care of a man who had decided something while he was in the back room. "Transfer filed 14 months ago," he said. "Property sold by E. Tilden to a holding company registered in Billings. Company name is Consolidated Land Partners." Clara looked at the paper. "The registered agent for Consolidated Land Partners," she said, reading. "C.R. Whitaker," Dorset said. "Yes." The office was very quiet. Nathan made no sound, but Clara felt the air in the room change the way it changes before something breaks. "Is there a sale price listed?" Clara said. Her voice was entirely steady. Dorset pointed to a figure. Clara looked at it. It was, as she had expected, roughly a third of the property's operating value. "And when was this transaction dated relative to the boarding house closure?" she said. Dorset checked another paper. "Closure was," he said, and paused and checked again. "The closure appears to have been filed 2 weeks after the transfer." Clara looked at him. "The property transferred to Whitaker 2 weeks before Tilden officially closed the business," she said. "That is what the dates indicate," Dorset said, which meant Tilden had not sold the property because the business failed. The business had been allowed to fail, or made to fail, after the property was already gone, and the workers, including Clara, had never been paid their final wages, because there was nothing left to pay them with, because the asset that would have covered those wages had already changed hands. She breathed slowly. "Mr. Dorset," she said, "if a person wanted to document a pattern of similar transactions, other properties that followed the same sequence in the valley, would those records be here?" Dorset looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment. "They would," he said. And then he went into the back room again, and this time he was gone for considerably longer. Nathan didn't speak until they were outside with the papers. Dorset had allowed them to copy 3 transfers in total, all following the same sequence, all with consolidated land partners, or a variation of it on the receiving end, all with dates that told the same story when you looked at them in order. He stood beside the wagon with the papers in his hand and looked at them for a moment. Then he said, "He's been doing this for at least 4 years. "At least," Clara said. "And nobody's put these together before." "Nobody had a reason to look at them side by side," Clara said. "Each one happened in a different month, in a different part of the valley. Individually, each one looks like a distressed sale. Together it looks like what it is," Nathan said. He folded the papers carefully and put them inside his jacket. He stood there for a moment more, and Clara watched him the way she'd been watching him for weeks, reading the thing behind the stillness. "Nathan," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formality of his title, and she noticed it as soon as it came out and didn't take it back. He noticed it too. She could tell. "This is enough to show people," she said. "This is enough to make the pattern visible. But Whitaker is going to know we were here. Dorset will tell him not out of malice, but because Whitaker will ask, and Dorset is a man who tells the truth when asked a direct question." "I know," Nathan said. "Which means he's going to move faster now." "I know that too. And the thing he's most likely to do faster," Clara said, "is make the situation with me the loudest part of whatever he says to people. Because if he can get this community to focus on me, on what I look like, on where I come from, on the question of what I'm really doing on your ranch, then the papers in your pocket stop being the story." Nathan looked at her. "And what do you want to do about that?" he said. Clara looked back at him. "I want to cook dinner for the valley," she said. Nathan blinked. It was the closest to visibly surprised she had ever seen him. "I want to host a dinner," she said, "at the ranch. For the families in this valley, the ranchers and their wives and their hands. I want to feed them. I want them to sit at a table where I cooked the meal, and I served it, and they tasted it. And I want them to have to decide for themselves with their own mouths and their own judgment what kind of woman made it." The silence that followed was long. "That's either the bravest idea I've ever heard," Nathan said slowly, "or the most dangerous one." "Probably both," Clara said. Nathan looked at the papers in his jacket. Then he looked at her, and something happened in his face that she had not seen there before, not the small adjustment she'd been cataloging. Not the almost smile, but something deeper and more open. Something that looked like a man who had been standing at the edge of something for a long time and had just decided to trust the ground. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "Plan the dinner," he said. "Tell me what you need." She told him what she needed on the ride back, and he listened without interrupting. Which was the thing about Nathan Cole. She had come to rely on most when he listened. He actually listened fully and without the part of his mind already forming his response, and it was rarer than people understood. She needed 2 weeks to plan and prepare. She needed a full restocking of the pantry, which Nathan said he'd arrange. She needed the main room of the house cleared and set with tables, which Hale said he could manage when they got back, and Clara told him what they were doing. She needed word sent to specific families in the valley. She had a list which included the Voss family, because Eleanor deserved to see what came of her warning, and Garrett Moss, because Nathan believed he could be moved to say something in public if he saw what Clara was building toward. She did not, she said, want Whitaker invited. Not because she was afraid of him being there, but because a dinner without him would make him come anyway. He would hear about it, he would understand what it meant, and he would show up because men like him could not help inserting themselves into situations designed to minimize them. Nathan turned and looked at her when she said that. "You're expecting him to come uninvited," he said. "I'm counting on it," Clara said, and something in his expression, then in the particular quality of the way he looked at her on that wagon, on that road with the folded papers in his jacket, and the Montana afternoon going gold around them, told Clara that Nathan Cole was for the first time in 3 years looking at the future of his ranch and feeling something other than the dread of managing loss. She looked back at the road. She did not let herself think too far past the dinner. One thing at a time. The next 2 weeks were the hardest and the best Clara had worked in her life, and she had worked very hard for a very long time. She planned the menu with the precision she usually reserved for managing a crisis, which, in a sense, this was a meal that had to be so plainly, undeniably good that it became impossible to argue with. Not showy, not trying, real. The kind of food that made people put their forks down and look at each other and say something honest. She worked the garden every morning before breakfast and every evening after supper, and it responded the way neglected things respond when someone finally pays them proper attention. Slowly at first, then with a kind of urgency, as if making up for lost time. The wild herbs she'd saved on her first day had spread properly now. The green onion patch had tripled. She'd planted late-season squash from seeds she'd been carrying since the Tilden Road days. She kept seeds the way some women kept letters, folded and private and full of potential. Hale helped her in the evenings without being asked, appearing at the garden gate with tools after his day's work and working the back row in silence while she worked the front, and it was one of the most companionable things Clara had experienced in years, that quiet shared labor, nobody needing it to be anything other than what it was. Diego sourced 2 rabbits and a side of venison from somewhere he didn't explain, and left them on the kitchen table with a note that said only for the dinner. Clara used both. Emmett was put in charge of setting up tables in the main room, a task he approached with the focused energy of a young man who has been given a clear purpose and an audience to imagine. He rearranged the room 3 times before Clara told him the third arrangement was the right one, which it was, and he glowed about it for the rest of the day. Nathan, during all of this, did something Clara hadn't expected. He cleaned the house, not just the main room, all of it. Slowly, over the 2 weeks, in the early mornings before she came down, and in the evenings after the kitchen was done, she would find things that had been cleared and cleaned and put right. A window that had been stuck now opening smoothly. A shelf that had been crooked now level. A rug that had been pushed against a wall now laid properly in the center of the hallway. She never mentioned it. He never mentioned it. But it was there in the careful and deliberate way a man tends something he has decided is worth tending again, and she felt it every time she found another small evidence of it, something low and warm and difficult to name. One morning she came downstairs and found fresh wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen windowsill. She stopped. She stood in front of them for a long moment. They were not fancy, just the small blue and yellow things that grew in the east pasture, the kind a person picks without thinking too much about it because their hand simply reaches for them. She did not ask him about the flowers. He did not mention them. But that evening at supper, when the men were all talking over each other about the upcoming dinner, and who was likely to come, and whether old Harmon from the creek property would actually show up in clean clothes, or whether that was, as Emmett put it, a question of optimism versus reality, Clara looked down the length of the table, and Nathan was already looking at her. He looked away first. Clara went back to her meal. She was not going to let herself make too much of small things. But she was also not going to pretend she hadn't seen them. The dinner fell on a Saturday, and they got both more and less than they bargained for, which is the nature of every plan that actually means something. More because 17 families came. Clara had expected 12. Eleanor Voss arrived early with her husband Gerald, who was a large, quiet man with an honest face, and Eleanor helped Clara carry dishes from the kitchen to the table for the first hour without being asked and without making anything of it. Just picked up whatever needed carrying and carried it, and Clara understood that this was how Eleanor Voss expressed the things she didn't say. Garrett Moss came with his wife and his 2 eldest sons, and when he shook Nathan's hand at the door, he held it a beat longer than usual and said something too low for Clara to hear. And Nathan nodded once with his jaw set, in the way that meant he was managing something that mattered. Less because Whitaker did not arrive in the first hour or the second, and Clara had been counting on him being there, and his absence was a different kind of problem than his presence would have been, not better, just different. And she kept one part of her attention at the door while the rest of her ran the dinner. The meal went perfectly, which Clara would later feel strange saying because it sounded like vanity, and it wasn't. She meant that it did exactly what food does when it's made right, which is that it made people relax. It made them stop performing their wariness and just eat. The venison was rich and slow-cooked and fell apart in a way that made the room go briefly quiet with the particular silence of people experiencing something good. The biscuits were the same ones she'd made on her first night because she trusted them, and the garden vegetables came out roasted and simple and tasted, as Hale said later, like someone had made a decision about them. People ate. People talked. The tension that Clara had felt walking into town for weeks, that particular frequency of judgment and speculation, it didn't disappear, but it softened the way a fist softens when something unexpected makes the hand want to open. Mrs. Harmon, who had not spoken to Clara directly in the 3 times they'd encountered each other in town, ate 2 servings of the venison stew and then came to find Clara in the kitchen to ask in a voice that was more self-conscious than hostile what she'd used to season it. Clara told her. Mrs. Harmon nodded and said, "My mother used sage that way," and then seemed briefly surprised by herself. "It's a good instinct," Clara said kindly and without ceremony. Mrs. Harmon went back to the table, and Clara watched her go and felt something loosen very slightly in the room's texture. It was not a dramatic conversion. It was not a moment. It was just a woman and another woman talking about sage. And sometimes that is exactly what it takes. Whitaker arrived at 8:30. Clara knew it before she heard him, because she saw Nathan's posture change at the far end of the room, a subtle thing. The way his shoulders organized themselves differently, a weight resettling. And then she heard the door, and there he was. He came in with a smile and a greeting for the room that was practiced and warm, and landed on no one in particular, the smile of a man who is assessing the situation while appearing to simply arrive. He had not been invited. Several people in the room noticed this and said nothing, which was its own kind of information. He made his way toward Nathan, stopping to exchange pleasantries with 2 of the ranchers, and Clara watched him from the kitchen doorway, with the dishcloth in her hands, and made herself stay still. Not yet. She needed to understand what he was going to do before she responded to it. Nathan greeted him without warmth and without visible anger, which took a degree of control that Clara recognized because she had been exercising the same degree herself for the better part of a month. "Didn't expect to see you here, Whitaker," Nathan said. "Heard there was a gathering?" Whitaker said pleasantly, "Thought I'd offer my regards." "Generous of you," Nathan said in a tone that made generous sound like a scientific term. Whitaker's eyes moved around the room cataloging and landed on Clara in the kitchen doorway. He smiled at her. She held the dishcloth and looked back at him. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the room temperature shifted slightly in the way rooms do when something with edges enters them. "Fine meal from what I've heard." "Thank you," Clara said, evenly. "Can I get you a plate?" Something flickered in his expression. He hadn't expected that. The offer was a trap he had no easy way to refuse because refusing hospitality in a room full of people was its own statement, and accepting it meant sitting down at her table, which was an entirely different kind of statement. He sat down. Clara brought him a plate. She served him the same food she had served everyone else with the same care. She had served everyone else because that was who she was, and she was not going to be otherwise for him. He ate. And then he did what she had known he would do eventually, because it was the only move left that he had. He waited for a quiet moment in the general conversation, and he said to the table, in a tone of friendly concern, "It's good to see Cole's ranch pulling together. These hard times take a toll. Sometimes a man in grief makes arrangements he might not make otherwise." He paused. "I hope everyone here is confident in how this particular situation is being managed." The room went careful. Clara set down the pitcher she was holding. Nathan said nothing. And it was Garrett Moss who spoke first from his end of the table, in the deliberate voice of a man who has decided this is the moment. "I'm confident in what I see," Moss said. "I see a working ranch that looks better than it has in 3 years. I see men who are fed and rested. I see a meal on this table that nobody's going to forget." He looked at Whitaker directly. "I'm not sure what arrangement you're concerned about, Charles. But I'll tell you the ones I'm concerned about are the ones that turned my brother's north parcel into a rail interest's profit margin inside of 8 months." The room was very quiet. Whitaker's smile didn't disappear, but it became a different thing entirely. "Garrett," he started. "I've been sitting on that for 2 years, Moss said. And there was no aggression in his voice, only the particular weight of a man who has decided that sitting on something is no longer acceptable. My brother trusted you. Tilden trusted you. And I've been watching you drive out here, and I've been watching the way you talk about this woman." He nodded toward Clara. "And I'll say plain what I think you want Cole's land, and she's the most convenient lever you can find, and I'm not going to sit at this table and pretend I don't see that." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Gerald Voss set his fork down with a small, deliberate sound. "I'll second that," he said, quiet, final, like a door closing on one thing and opening on another. Whitaker looked around the room. He looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at him, and Nathan's face was not angry, which was perhaps the most powerful thing about it. It was simply clear the way a man's face is clear when he has made a decision and is entirely at peace with it. "I think you should go, Charles," Nathan said. It wasn't a question. Whitaker straightened. He looked once more at Clara, and this time the look was not the stored information look from the yard or the thin-smiled pleasantry of his arrival. It was something rawer and smaller. The look of a man who has just discovered that the situation he thought he was managing has been managing him. He stood up. He said nothing further to the room. He left. The door closed behind him, and the room stayed quiet for about 4 seconds, and then Emmett, who had no capacity whatsoever for extended dramatic silence, said, "Well, anyone want more biscuits?" And the room exhaled into something that was close enough to laughter that it didn't matter what you called it. Clara went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter with her hands on the edge of it, and breathed long and slow, and let the feeling move through her. Not triumph exactly, though there was some of that, but something more fundamental. The feeling of having been tested at the exact depth of everything she had and having held. She heard boots in the doorway. Nathan. She knew from the step. She didn't turn around. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. A pause. "That was brave," he said. "What you planned, what you did." "Moss did it," Clara said. "Voss did it." "They did it because of what you built in this room tonight," Nathan said. "They did it because you put something on this table that made them remember what kind of people they want to be." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How are you?" A pause, longer than usual. "Relieved," he said. And then more quietly, "Grateful." She turned around. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, and in the dim light of the kitchen, he looked like a man who has set down something heavy that he had been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her. "It's going to be all right," she said. Not because she was certain, not because all the problems were solved, not because Whitaker was finished, or the land was safe, or the future was clear, but because she had learned in 27 years of hard living that there were moments when the true and necessary thing to say was not the cautious thing, but the human thing. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, and the word came out rough and quiet and entirely real. "I think it might be." From the other room, the sound of the dinner, continuing voices, the scrape of chairs. Emmett saying something that made 3 people laugh. Hale's low rumble of response, the particular warmth of people who have shared something true and are not quite ready to let the evening end. Clara turned back to the counter and started washing dishes, and Nathan stayed in the doorway, and neither of them said anything else, and the kitchen held the warmth of the stove, and the meal, and the evening. And something more, something that had been building quietly for weeks. In the particular way things build when nobody is pushing them, when they are simply allowed to grow in whatever direction they need to go. Outside, the Montana night was clear and cold and enormous. Inside, the Cole Ranch was warm and full and alive. And Clara Whitmore stood at the sink in the kitchen she had brought back to life, washing the dishes from the dinner that had changed everything, and she was in the only way that had ever mattered to her exactly where she was supposed to be. Whitaker was not finished. Clara had known this even as she stood at the kitchen sink washing the dinner dishes with Nathan in the doorway and the sound of satisfied voices from the other room. She had known it the way she knew most things about men who operated the way Whitaker operated. Not from personal history with him specifically, but from 27 years of watching how power behaved when it was publicly embarrassed. It didn't retreat. It reorganized. The morning after the dinner, she found out how. Emmett came in from the early supply run looking like a man who had been handed something he didn't know how to carry. His usual easy expression replaced by something careful and tight. "What is it?" Clara said. Emmett set the supply bags on the counter and looked at Nathan, who had come in from the yard behind him. "There's a notice posted at the general store," Emmett said, "on the public board." Nathan said nothing, waited. "It's a legal notice," Emmett said. "From a land attorney in Billings. It says there's a disputed claim on the Cole Ranch's eastern water rights. Says the claim was filed last week with the Territorial Land Office." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara set down the pan she was holding. "The eastern water rights," Nathan said. His voice was flat. "Yes, sir. That's the creek feed," Nathan said. "That's the water supply for the eastern pasture. That's where 60% of my cattle graze in the dry months." "Yes, sir," Emmett said again more quietly. Nathan turned and walked out of the kitchen without a word. Clara heard the back door close, and then she heard nothing. She looked at Emmett. "How old is the notice?" she said. "Posted yesterday evening," Emmett said. "After the dinner. Couldn't have been more than a couple hours after Whitaker left." "Who is the attorney?" "Name on the notice is Alderman Holt. Office address in Billings." Clara filed that name. "Go get Hale," she said, quietly. Hale knew more about the Cole Ranch's land history than anyone alive, including Nathan. Because Hale had been there before Nathan arrived, he'd worked the property under the previous owner and stayed on when Nathan bought it 15 years ago, and he carried the detailed, specific knowledge of a man who had watched land change hands and understood exactly what that meant in practice. He came into the kitchen and Clara told him what Emmett had reported, and Hale's face moved through something slow and deliberate before it settled. "Eastern water rights," he said. "You know the history," Clara said. "I know every inch of that creek's legal history," Hale said. "Nathan's title is clean. Those water rights were established when the Territorial Land Office granted the original deed. They're attached to the land itself, not separately negotiable. So the claim is false," Clara said. "The claim shouldn't exist," Hale said. "Which means either someone manufactured paperwork or they found a clerical gap somewhere in the original filing, and they're going to try to make it look like a gap that matters." "How long would that take to resolve in court?" Clara said. Hale looked at her. "Months," he said. "Maybe longer." And in the meantime, Hale said, if a judge issued a temporary injunction while the claim is being reviewed, he stopped. Nathan couldn't use the eastern pasture, Clara said. In the dry months, Hale said, without that pasture, he'd have to sell cattle he's not ready to sell to free up grazing. He'd take a loss, a real one. The picture was completely clear. Whitaker had been turned down at the dinner table in front of half the valley. He could not use social pressure anymore, not after Moss and Voss had spoken, so he had moved to the one arena where he had leverage that didn't require anyone's good opinion, the legal one. And he had done it fast, reorganized in hours. Clara respected the speed, the way you can respect a dangerous thing without approving of it. Hale, she said, the original land deed. Where would Nathan keep it? His office? Hale said. He's got a lockbox. Does he know where the deed is? Hale almost smiled, which on his face was a very small thing. Nathan Cole knows where every piece of paper on this ranch is, he said. That man organized his grief by organizing every document he owned. It's the most ordered set of files you've ever seen in your life. That landed somewhere unexpected in Clara's chest. All right, she said. We need to look at that deed before we do anything else. Shanghai. Nathan came back inside 40 minutes later. His face was composed and very still in the particular way that meant he'd been outside long enough to have his reaction privately, and was now ready to function again, which Clara had identified as one of the most characteristically Nathan things about him. I know about Alderman Holt, he said before she could speak. I've already sent word to Moss. His cousin is a land attorney in Helena. Clara looked at him. You moved fast, she said. I was expecting something, Nathan said. Not this specifically, but something. He pulled off his jacket and hung it up. Whitaker doesn't absorb a loss in public without answering it. The deed, Clara said. I've got it, Nathan said. I'll look at it tonight, and so will Moss's cousin when he gets here. When is he coming? Moss sent a wire this morning. His cousin should be here by Thursday. Clara looked at him. You sent word to Moss this morning, she said. Before Emmett got back from town, Nathan said. How did you know? Because I watched Whitaker leave that dinner, Nathan said simply. And I know what that look means. He said it without drama, without bravado. Just fact. And in that fact was something Clara hadn't fully registered before that Nathan Cole had been paying attention to. All along in his quiet, contained, nothing wasted way he had been reading the situation with the same precision she had. She hadn't been managing this alone. She had thought she was. But she hadn't been. The understanding of that moved through her quietly, the way warmth moves through cold hands, not all at once, but spreading. Thursday, she said. Thursday, he confirmed. Then we cook until Thursday, and we don't let the men worry, Clara said. Nathan looked at her steadily. Agreed, he said. But the men already knew something was happening because ranch hands always know which is one of the things people who have never worked alongside others tend to underestimate the particular intelligence of people who live in close quarters and depend on reading each other for practical survival. Diego found Clara in the garden that afternoon. He didn't say anything right away. He worked beside her for several minutes, turning soil before he said quietly, "The water claim." "You heard?" Clara said. "Emmett talks," Diego said without judgment. "He does," Clara agreed. Diego was quiet for another minute. "My family," he said, "had land in New Mexico territory. Good land. Somebody found a way to make a paper dispute about our water access. We fought it for 4 years. He paused. We lost the land. Clara stopped working and looked at him. Diego kept his eyes on the soil. "I stayed on this ranch because Nathan Cole is a straight man," Diego said. "Because what he says is what he means, and what he does is what he said." He paused. "And because you came here and made it feel like a place that was trying to live again." He looked up at her. "Don't let them take it." His voice was entirely even, But what was in it was not even at all. "I'm not going to," Clara said. Diego nodded once and went back to the soil, and they worked the rest of the afternoon in a silence that was nothing like absence. Thursday arrived with the Moss cousin whose name was Robert Langley, and who was a compact, energetic man of 40 with a case full of papers and the focused intensity of someone who found fraudulent land claims genuinely personally offensive, which Clara immediately identified as an extremely useful quality in an attorney. He sat at the kitchen table with Nathan and the deed and the notice from Alderman Holt, and Clara brought coffee, and then sat down, because Nathan looked at her when she started to leave and said, "Stay," in a tone that was not a request so much as a statement of what made sense, and she stayed. Langley went through the papers with the speed of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. He found it in 11 minutes. "There," he said, and pointed to a line in the original deed. "Water rights attached to parcel as filed under territorial code, see the reference number." He pulled out Holt's notice and put it beside the deed. Holt's claim cites a gap in the filing sequence. Says there's a reference number that doesn't correspond to an active entry in the territorial office's records. "Is there?" Nathan said. "There's a transcription error," Langley said. "In the original filing, one digit transposed in the reference number. The entry exists, it just wasn't correctly cross-referenced in the index." He leaned back. "This is not a gap. This is a clerical error from 1871 that has never mattered because nobody ever contested it." "But it gives Holt grounds to file," Nathan said. "It gives Holt grounds to file a claim that will fail," Langley said. "Assuming we correct the transcription error through the proper channel, which is a straightforward filing with the territorial office, and assuming we then contest Holt's claim with the corrected documentation." "How long?" Nathan said. 6 to 8 weeks, Langley said. "If we move immediately." "And the temporary injunction risk," Clara said. Langley looked at her. "She knows about the injunction question," Nathan said without elaboration. Langley accepted this. "The injunction would require Holt to demonstrate probable cause that the claim has merit," he said. "With the corrected filing in hand, that becomes very difficult. The key is getting the correction filed before Holt can get in front of a judge." "How fast can we file?" Nathan said. "If I ride to Helena tomorrow," Langley said, "and I take the deed with me, I can have the correction filed by end of next week." Nathan looked at the deed. It was a piece of paper, 15 years old, worn at the folds, and it represented everything he had built on this land: the cattle, the pastures, the creek, the graves on the hill above the eastern pasture, his wife's garden that was growing again. "Take it," Nathan said. Langley nodded and began organizing his papers. Clara went to refill the coffee, and when she came back, Nathan was standing at the window that faced the yard, his back to the room, his hands at his sides. She set the coffee pot down. She stood behind him, at a distance that was close enough to be present, and far enough to give him the space he sometimes needed around important moments. "Nathan," she said. He didn't turn, but she felt his awareness of her shift. "He's not going to stop at the water rights," she said. "Even if Langley files and the claim fails, he's going to try something else." "I know," Nathan said. "Which means we have to stop being reactive," Clara said. "We have to take something to him first." He turned. "The documents from Dorset," he said. "The land transfer papers, the 3 fraudulent sales laid out in sequence. If Langley takes those to Helena along with the deed," Clara said, "and presents them to the Territorial Land Authority, not as proof of crime, not yet, but as documentation of a pattern that the authority should be aware of. It puts Whitaker under scrutiny before he can file anything else," Nathan said. "It makes the next move he makes look like what it is," Clara said. "Because right now, each thing he does looks individual, isolated. A water claim here, a sanitary notice there, a social pressure campaign somewhere else. The moment someone in authority is looking at all of it at once." "It looks like a man operating a system," Nathan said. "Yes," Clara said. They looked at each other. They looked. This was the thing she had been moving toward since the night she'd sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and a piece of paper. not just defending the ranch from Whitaker's individual moves, making the pattern visible to the people who had the authority to see it for what it was. Langley came back into the kitchen with his case packed. Nathan turned to him. "There are additional documents," Nathan said. "Land transfers, 3 of them from the past 4 years. We got them from Dorset at the county office." He looked at Clara. She had the folder. She had been keeping it since they came back from Red Creek, in the kitchen drawer under the spare candle and the string where nobody looked. She put it on the table. Langley opened it. He read the first transfer, then the second, then the third. He set them down and looked up at Nathan and then at Clara, and there was something in his expression that was not exactly surprise, but was something adjacent. The look of a man who has been given more ammunition than he expected and is rapidly restructuring his understanding of the battle. "Where did you get these?" he said. "Public record," Clara said. "County clerk's office, Red Creek." "Did Dorset know what you were looking for?" "He knew the name Tilden," Clara said. "And when I asked about the pattern, he went into the back room and came out with 3 more files." Langley looked at the documents again. "Dorset is a good man," he said half to himself. "He is," Clara agreed. Langley looked at Nathan. "I can take these to Helena," he said slowly. "I know the Territorial Land Authority's senior examiner. If I present these as a pattern, not an accusation, not yet, but a documented sequence requiring review." He paused. "It won't be fast. These things are never fast. But it opens an inquiry. And an open inquiry means every move Whitaker makes from here on is being watched by someone who already has context." "That's all I need," Nathan said. "I don't need him destroyed. I need him watched." Langley picked up the folder. "I'll leave tomorrow at first light," he said. After Langley left, and the kitchen was quiet, and the afternoon had moved into that particular gold hour that Montana afternoons had in the fall, Clara stood at the kitchen counter and felt for the first time in weeks something that was adjacent to still. Not finished, not resolved, but still. She was standing there with her hands quiet on the counter edge when Nathan came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, not standing the way he usually did, not keeping the posture of a man ready to move, but actually sitting the way a person sits when they are done managing something for the moment. He was quiet. Clara turned and leaned against the counter and looked at him. "You should eat something," she said. "Probably," he said. But he didn't move. She pulled bread and salt pork and the remains of the morning's biscuits from where they were wrapped and put them on the table, and she poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him, and sat down across from him with the other. He looked at the food and then at her. "You're eating with me," he said, not surprised but noticing. "If that's all right," Clara said. "It's all right," he said, and the way he said it was very quiet and entirely sincere. They ate. For a while, neither of them said anything, and it was the easiest silence Clara had been in since she arrived. Not the silence of 2 people being careful around each other, but the silence of 2 people who had been through something together and were resting in the fact of having come through it. Then Nathan said, "Tell me about before." Clara looked at him. "Before," she said. "Before Tilden Road," he said. "You didn't start cooking at 30. Where'd you learn?" Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "My aunt," she said. "My mother died when I was 9. I went to live with my mother's sister in Missouri. She ran a boarding house smaller than Tilden's, but the same idea. She took me in, and she put me to work in the kitchen from the first week." "And you didn't mind that," Nathan said. "I minded the reason," Clara said. "I didn't mind the kitchen." She paused. "The kitchen was the one place where it didn't matter what I looked like. I was 9 years old, and too big for my age, and already hearing things about it. But in the kitchen what mattered was the bread rising, the stew not burning, whether the biscuits were right. Nobody cared about my size when the food was good." Nathan looked at her. "So you stayed in kitchens," he said. "I stayed in kitchens," she said, "for 18 years. Because they were the one place I got to be good at something instead of wrong about something." Nathan held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the table for a moment. "That's a hard reason to love a thing," he said. "Most reasons are," Clara said. He looked up. "What would you do," he said slowly, "if you didn't have to justify being somewhere, if you could just be somewhere because you wanted to be?" The question was simple on its surface, and not simple at all underneath. Clara thought about it honestly. "I'd still cook," she said. "But I'd cook differently. Not to prove anything. Just because it's the thing I know how to do better than anything else, and because—" She stopped. "Because," he said. "Because when I feed people," she said quietly, "and they sit down and the food is good and the room is warm and they stop worrying for an hour, I feel like I've done something real, something that matters." She paused. "I don't need it to be a proof anymore. I just need it to be true." Nathan was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her for weeks, but it was more open now than it had ever been, as if some final layer of the distance he kept had quietly dissolved sometime in the past several hours without either of them marking the exact moment. "It is true," he said. "What you do here, it's true every single day." Clara looked at him across the table. She had been told kind things before by people who meant them. But something about the way Nathan said it without embellishment, without the particular effort of a man constructing a compliment, made it land differently. It landed the way things land when they are simply accurate. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That's why it means something." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara." Something in his voice had changed registers slightly in a way she felt before she could name. She waited. "After Margaret," he said, and the name came out in its usual way, not easily, not painfully, but with the weight of something that had been lived with long enough to be known. "I closed a lot of things. Not on purpose. Just they closed, and I let them, because opening them again seemed—" He stopped, tried again. "It seemed like a risk I couldn't afford." Clara did not move, did not fill the silence. "And then you showed up on the road with that pot," he said, "and you were so—" He stopped again, and something crossed his face that might have been a man finding the right word, or might have been a man deciding to say the true one instead of the safe one. "You were so completely yourself. You didn't perform anything. You didn't try to seem like less than you were. You just looked me in the eye and told me you could feed my men, and you meant every word, and—" He set down his coffee cup. "Something opened," he said, "that I had not expected to open." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was going. Clara looked at Nathan Cole across the table. This contained careful, grief-weathered, honest man who had given her a kitchen and a roof, and without either of them naming it something considerably more than that over the weeks since, and she felt the specific weight of the moment, which was not heavy so much as true. The way true things have a quality of settling rather than pressing. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her. "I came here with nothing," she said. "And I have spent every day since trying not to be too much, too present, too—" She stopped. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't do that." She looked at him. "Don't make yourself smaller for this room," he said. "You never have in anything else. Don't do it now." Clara breathed. "I don't know what this is," she said honestly. "What's between us? I don't know how to name it." "Neither do I," Nathan said. "But I know it's real, and I know that real things deserve better than to be left unnamed, because the naming feels risky." A pause. "Are you willing to be risky?" Clara said. Something in his face shifted into the thing she had been watching build for weeks, and it was fully there now. Unguarded, the face of a man who has made a decision from the honest part of himself. "I'm willing to try," he said. "If you are." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I've been willing since about the second week." He made a sound that was absolutely unmistakably a laugh. Short reel surprised entirely out of him, and it changed his face completely. Opened it into something younger and warmer and more himself than anything she had seen yet. Clara felt her own smile come up before she could consider it, and she didn't take it back. They sat at the table in the kitchen she had brought back to life in the house he had quietly been tending, and the fire in the stove was warm, and the night outside was coming in cold and clear off the mountains, and somewhere in the pasture the cattle were settled, and in the bunkhouse the men were resting, and the ranch was alive around them in all the ways that mattered. "Well," Nathan said when the laughter had settled. "Well," Clara agreed. "We should probably talk about what comes next," he said. "Probably," she said, "but not tonight." He looked at her. "Tonight," Clara said, "I'm going to make supper, and you're going to eat it, and we're going to let today be what it was without trying to manage it into something organized." Nathan considered this. "That might be the wisest thing anyone has said in this kitchen," he said. "I have those occasionally," Clara said, and stood up to start the supper. And Nathan Cole stayed at the table and watched her move through the kitchen she had claimed as her own. And something in his posture was different from any version of it Clara had seen before, released somehow. Like a man who has been holding a door shut for a very long time, and has finally decided to open it and let in whatever was waiting on the other side. The stove was warm. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the last of the bread. Outside, the Montana stars were coming out one by one in the enormous dark, the way they did every night, whether or not anyone was watching, whether or not anything below them was going right or wrong, or somewhere in between. Inside, something had shifted, quietly, the way the most important things always shift, not with announcement, not with ceremony, but with the particular and unmistakable weight of two people deciding at the same moment to stop waiting for the ground to prove it would hold before they stepped forward. Clara made the supper. Nathan set the table, and the ranch moved into evening around them, steady and alive and entirely itself. 6 weeks after Robert Langley rode to Helena with the deed and the land transfer documents, the Territorial Land Authority opened a formal inquiry into Consolidated Land Partners and its principal agent, C.R. Whitaker. Clara found out on a Tuesday morning when Nathan came into the kitchen with a letter and set it on the table in front of her without a word and waited. She read it. Then she read it again. "It's not a conviction," Nathan said. "It's an inquiry." "It's enough," Clara said. And it was. Because an inquiry meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant that every move Whitaker made from this point forward would be documented and examined by people with the authority to act on what they found. The water rights claim against the Cole Ranch had already been suspended, pending review of the broader pattern Langley had presented. Alderman Holt, the Billings attorney, had reportedly withdrawn from the case 3 days after the inquiry opened, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how solid Holt had believed the claim was when he filed it. Emmett, when he heard the news, did something between a cheer and a whoop that startled the chickens. Hale read the letter Clara showed him, folded it carefully, handed it back and said, "Good Bernie," in the tone of a man delivering a verdict that required no elaboration. Diego said nothing. But that evening, he left a jar of something on the kitchen counter, preserves. Clara realized when she opened it, wild plum done up properly, sealed with wax. She didn't know when he'd made them or where he'd found the fruit, or when he'd had the time, and she didn't ask. She used them at breakfast the next morning, and nobody at the table said a word about where they'd come from. But Diego ate his biscuit with preserves with the expression of a man at peace with the world. The relief in the ranch was real, and it was earned, and Clara let herself feel it fully for exactly 1 day. Then she went back to work. Because the inquiry was not the end. It was the clearing of the immediate ground which was different, and she knew from experience that the space after a crisis resolved was exactly when people stopped paying attention to the things that needed tending, and she was not going to let that happen here. There was still the garden to bring fully into production before the first frost. There was still the pantry to build up properly for winter, which was coming faster than Emmett appreciated, no matter how many times Hale told him to look at the color of the morning sky. There was still the ranch to run the men to feed the daily work that did not pause for inquiry letters or emotional turning points, or the particular complicated warmth of whatever was happening between her and Nathan, which they had not named and were not rushing to name, but which was present in the kitchen every morning, like the coffee expected, relied upon making everything that came after it more possible. The first frost came on a Thursday night in early October, which Hale had predicted to within 48 hours, and which Emmett lost a bet about that Clara had advised him not to make. She had spent the 2 weeks before it preserving everything the garden had left to give 3 dozen jars of tomatoes, 2 of the wild plum Diego had sourced from somewhere upriver, preserved beans, dried herbs hung from the kitchen rafters, in the specific order she'd developed over years of doing it, so that she could reach for sage or thyme in the dark of a cold morning without needing light to find them. The morning after the frost, Nathan came into the kitchen earlier than usual. Clara was at the stove. She heard him stop in the doorway and then come in and pour his coffee and stand at the counter in the way he did, and she knew from the particular quality of his stillness that he had something he was working up to. She let him work. He drank half the coffee. Then he said, "I went up to the hill this morning." Clara kept her hands moving. The hill was where Margaret was buried. He went periodically, usually alone, usually early, and he never mentioned it when he came back, unless he had something specific to say about it. "I told her about you," he said. Clara stopped. Not dramatically. Just stopped with her hands still and listened. "I told her what you've done here," Nathan said. "What the ranch looks like now. What the kitchen smells like. What the men are like since you came." He paused. "I told her I'd been carrying the place like a punishment for 3 years, and you came and made it feel like a home again, and I didn't have words for what to do with that." Clara turned slowly and looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. "What did she say?" Clara said quietly. He looked up. "She didn't," he said. "She's gone. That's real, and I know it's real." He set the cup down. "But I know what she would have said, because I knew her for 12 years, and she was the most practical woman who ever lived." He almost smiled. "She would have said I was being a fool about it, and that a cold kitchen doesn't honor anyone, and that I should be grateful something warm found its way back in." Clara looked at him. "She sounds like a good woman," Clara said. "She was the best I knew," Nathan said. "Until—" He stopped. Clara waited. Nathan looked at her directly, the way he did when he meant something absolutely. "Until you," he said. The kitchen held the warmth of the stove and the herbs drying from the rafters and the preserved jars lined up on the shelves and the morning light coming through the east window, and everything Clara had built in this space since she arrived with 4 coins and a cast-iron pot and nothing else. She breathed. "Nathan," she said. "I'm not asking you to replace her," he said. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than exactly what you are. I just need you to know." He stopped again, found it. "I need you to know that what I said the other night was the truest thing I've said in 3 years, and I've been thinking about it every day since." "So have I," Clara said. He looked at her. "Every day," she said. "Since before that night, if I'm honest." Something loosened in his face, the last of whatever had been held back. "Then I'd like to stop thinking about it separately," he said, "and start figuring out what it means. Together, if that's what you want." Clara held his gaze. She had been asked many things in her life. She had been asked to be smaller and quieter and less visible, and more grateful and less present. She had been asked to prove herself and justify herself and account for herself in rooms where the accounting was never going to be sufficient because the problem was never her performance. This was the first time someone had asked her to be more present, more here, more herself in this place, beside this man in this kitchen she had brought back from the dead. "That's what I want," she said. Nathan nodded once. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank the rest of it and set it in the basin in the absolutely ordinary way of a man concluding a morning conversation before he goes to work. And that ordinariness was the truest expression of what he meant. This was not a grand gesture, not a performance. It was simply real. And he was treating it as real, which was the only way Nathan Cole knew how to treat anything that mattered. "I'll be back for lunch," he said. "I know," Clara said. He walked out. Clara stood in her kitchen for a moment with her hands at her sides and the morning around her, and something full and certain and entirely new settled into the center of her chest and stayed there. She went back to work. The change between them was not dramatic. That was the thing Clara found most remarkable about it. In the weeks that followed, how quietly the ground had shifted, how naturally the new arrangement of things settled into the daily rhythm of the ranch. He started sitting at the table in the evenings when the kitchen work was done, not in the standing at the counter way, but sitting with his coffee, or sometimes without, and they talked. About the ranch, the cattle, the winter plans, the things Langley sent from Helena about the inquiry's progress. About smaller things, too. The mare with the bad foot in the north pasture, whether Emmett was going to stop losing Hale's good tools before Spring Diego's preserves, and the ongoing mystery of how he'd had time to make them. And then about larger things. Gradually, the way you get to larger things, when the smaller ones have been tended to Margaret and what the years of her illness had done to Nathan, and the particular grief of watching someone you love diminish and being unable to reverse it. Clara's mother dead at 31, of a fever that shouldn't have been fatal, and the 9-year-old girl who had gone to her aunt's house and found salvation in a kitchen because it was the only room that would have her as she was. They traded these things carefully and honestly in the evenings in the warm kitchen, and Clara understood that this was what it looked like when two people who had both learned to protect themselves decided to stop doing that with each other. It was not easy. Ease was not the right word. But it was real, and real was better. Emmett noticed first, because Emmett noticed everything social, the way Hale noticed everything practical, and one morning he came into the kitchen with the completely transparent expression of a young man trying to have no expression whatsoever, and asked Clara if she needed anything from the supply shed. "I was just there yesterday," Clara said. "Right," Emmett said. "Didn't move." "Is there something you want to say, Emmett?" Clara said. "No, ma'am," he said immediately. "Are you certain?" A pause. "I'm real glad you're here, Miss Clara," he said, and the sincerity of it was so complete and so unperformed that it went directly past everything and landed somewhere important. "Thank you, Emmett," she said quietly. "Nathan's." He started, and then stopped himself visibly and reorganized. "The ranch is better," he said. "All of it is all I meant." "I know what you meant," Clara said. "Go check on the south fence." He went clearly relieved, and Clara smiled at the kitchen window for a moment before she went back to the bread dough. The letter from Langley arrived in the 3rd week of October with details that shifted everything again. The territorial inquiry had found that Consolidated Land Partners had over 6 years acquired 14 properties in Montana Territory through documented patterns of manufactured distress, false disputes, fraudulent notices, deliberate interference with operating businesses that preceded sale. The inquiry was being referred to the Federal Land Commissioner in Washington. Whitaker's name was attached to every filing. The 2 ranchers who had sold to him under duress were being reviewed for potential remediation, which did not mean they would recover their land. Langley was careful to note, but which meant the system was looking at what had happened to them. Nathan read the letter at the kitchen table with Clara beside him and Hale standing near the door. When he finished, he set it down. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "The Tilden workers." Clara looked at him. "The wages," he said. "That were never paid." He looked at her directly. "You never got what you were owed." "I know," Clara said. "Langley should know about that specifically," Nathan said. "If the inquiry is reviewing the Tilden transfer and Whitaker's connection to it." "I'll write it down," Clara said. "Everything I know. Dates, amounts, names of the other workers, if I can remember them." She paused. "I don't know that it will come to anything." "It might," Nathan said. "And even if it doesn't, it should be in the record." Clara looked at him. She thought of the 9 women and 4 men who had worked at Tilden Road alongside her. People who had shown up every day and done honest work and gone home with nothing at the end of it because of a transaction they hadn't known was happening while they were doing that honest work. "I'll write it tonight," she said. Nathan nodded. Hale said from the door, "I knew 2 of the Tilden hands, Good workers. One of them had to leave the territory entirely because he couldn't find work after the closure. The weight of that sat with all three of them. "Write it down," Nathan said again. "All of it." And Clara did. November came in cold and definitive, the way Montana. November always did, and the ranch moved into its winter rhythm. Shorter days the cattle brought to the closer pastures, the kitchen becoming the warmest room in the universe, in the specific way that kitchens become in winter, when the heat from the stove is not just comfort, but necessity. Clara loved it. She had not expected to love winter in Montana, coming from Missouri, where winter was gray and damp and endless. But this was different. The cold was clear and enormous, and the snow, when it came, made the world quiet in a way that was not lonely, but spacious. And the kitchen, in contrast, was warm and full, and smelled like everything she had been building since August. The men settled into winter the way ranch hands do, the work slower, the evenings longer, the bunkhouse louder with cards and stories, and the kind of arguments that come from 6 men spending a great deal of time in close quarters and are entirely without real anger. Clara fed them through all of it. She made the kind of food that belonged to winter-long cooked stews, roasted root vegetables from the garden she'd put up in the fall soups built from stock. She'd been accumulating since October bread that took all afternoon to rise and came out of the oven with a crust that cracked when you broke it, and a warm, soft center that Emmett once said was the actual definition of the word good. She taught him how to make it one evening when the weather was too bad for outdoor work, and he had appeared in the kitchen doorway with the specific look of a young man who did not know what to do with himself. "Wash your hands," she said without looking up. "I wasn't," he started. "Emmett, wash your hands and come help me with the bread." He washed his hands. He was a surprisingly good student, attentive, careful with the dough once Clara explained why the handling mattered, asking the right questions. By the time the bread went into the oven, he was standing with flour on his hands, looking at the dough with the expression of a person who has just discovered an unexpected competence. "My mother would have—" He started and stopped. Clara waited. "She always said cooking was the one thing that made sense," Emmett said, "when everything else was wrong." "She was right," Clara said. He looked at her. "You miss her," Clara said. Not a question. "Every day," Emmett said, simply. "Then cook something she made," Clara said. "Tell me what it was, and we'll make it." Emmett looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between surprised and undone. "She made a gingerbread," he said quietly, "around Christmas, with molasses. The whole house smelled like it." "We have molasses," Clara said. "Do you remember what else went in it?" Emmett thought. Clara let him think, and they spent the next hour reconstructing a dead woman's gingerbread from a 19-year-old's memory, adjusting proportions based on what smelled right, debating whether the spice was more ginger or cinnamon, until Clara said both, and the result, when it came out of the oven, made Emmett stand very still for a moment, with his hand on the table. "That's it," he said. His voice was different. "That's exactly it." Clara looked at him. "Then we'll make it every Christmas," she said. Emmett looked at her. "While you're here," he said. Clara met his eyes. "While I'm here," she said. And she said it in a way that answered the real question he was asking, which was not about gingerbread. He nodded and smiled, and Clara put the gingerbread on the table and called the men in and let the evening be what it was. It was a Saturday evening in late November when Nathan asked her. Not the way she might have imagined it once in some earlier version of herself that had thought about such things before she'd learned to stop thinking about them. Not with ceremony or preparation or words arranged in advance. They were washing dishes. He had started helping her in the evenings, after the men went to the bunkhouse, had started it, without remark sometime in October, and had simply continued the way he continued. Most things he decided were worth doing. He washed, she dried, and they talked or didn't, and it was one of the most straightforward daily pleasures Clara had ever experienced, which told her something important about what she had been missing for most of her adult life. They were almost done with the evening's dishes when he said, still looking at the basin, "I want you to stay." Clara dried a cup. "I am staying," she said. "I want you to stay as more than my cook," he said. She put the cup down on the shelf. He turned from the basin and dried his hands on the dish towel and looked at her. And his face was exactly what she had come to know of him, contained honest, not performing anything. "I want you to stay as my wife," he said. "If you're willing, if that's what you want." He said it the way he said all important things. No embellishment, no cushioning. Just the true thing directly. Clara looked at him. She thought about the road in August, the wagon, the 4 coins, the cast iron pot, the 7 men who hadn't been fed properly in months, and the kitchen that had forgotten how to be a kitchen, and the garden that had given up without anyone to insist that it shouldn't. She thought about the dinner and the water rights, and Langley writing to Helena and the letter with the inquiry, and Emmett's mother's gingerbread and Diego's preserves, and Hale working the garden row in the evenings without being asked, and Eleanor Voss arriving through the back gate with a warning and a kind of loyalty that had no formal name. She thought about Nathan on the hill above the eastern pasture, telling Margaret about the woman who had come and made the kitchen warm again. She thought about what she had told him that she'd been willing since about the 2nd week. "Nathan," she said. "Yes," he said. "You understand what you're asking," she said. Not just the practical part, the she stopped, found the right word. The public part. In this valley. A man like you choosing a woman like me. His expression didn't shift. "A man like me," he repeated, and the way he said it was not dismissive but precise. The way he was when he wanted to make sure he understood something correctly. "What kind of man is that?" "A respected man," Clara said. "A man whose opinion in this valley carries weight. People will talk." "People talk already," Nathan said. "They talked when you arrived. They talked when Whitaker started his campaign. They talked at the dinner, and then Moss talked louder, and Voss talked louder than that, and the talking changed." He looked at her steadily. "Let them talk. What they say about you, and what you actually are, have never had anything to do with each other. I'm not interested in managing their opinion. I'm interested in you. In this." He gestured between them simply without drama. "In the life that's been building in this house since August," Clara breathed. "And a woman like me," she said quietly. "Is that something you've thought about truly?" Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "I've thought about nothing else since the first evening," he said. "When you brought that stew to the table, and my men smiled for the first time in I don't know how long, and I watched you move through this kitchen like you had always belonged in it." He paused. "You are the most capable and honest and—" He stopped. Tried again, and she could see him choosing between the safe word and the true one, and choosing the true one. "And the most beautiful woman I have ever watched walk into a room and refuse to apologize for taking up space in it." The word landed before Clara could prepare for it. She had been called capable. She had been called hardworking, reliable, useful. She had been called a good cook and a fair woman and occasionally grudgingly impressive. She had never been called beautiful by someone who looked at her the way Nathan was looking at her, not performing it, not offering it as consolation or negotiation, but simply reporting what he saw. Her eyes did something she had been very carefully not letting them do for months. She didn't turn away. "Yes," she said. Nathan blinked. "Yes, to which part?" "All of it," Clara said. "Yes to staying. Yes to being your wife. Yes to the life that's been building in this house since August." She looked at him directly the way she always looked at him without flinching, because she had learned that this was the most important thing she could offer him, and the most important thing she could offer herself. "Yes to all of it." Nathan reached out and took her hand. His hand was large and work-roughened and entirely warm, and he held hers the way he held most things steady, without excess, exactly right. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. And that was enough. That was everything. Two people who had both learned the hard way not to trust easy words, choosing instead the simplest ones in a warm kitchen at the end of an ordinary evening. They were married in December on a Saturday in the main room of the ranch house where Clara had hosted the dinner that had changed the Valley's understanding of what the Cole Ranch was. Eleanor Voss came, and Gerald and Garrett Moss, and a handful of others from the Valley who had been at the dinner and had been watching the month since with a quiet attention. Hale stood up with Nathan. Emmett tried not to cry with mixed results. Diego stood at the back of the room with his arms folded and an expression of complete satisfaction that he didn't bother to minimize. Clara wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Eleanor Voss had brought out to the ranch 3 weeks before the wedding, appearing at the kitchen door with it folded, and saying only that it had come from the last bolt of blue wool at the general store, and that she had thought of Clara when she saw it. It was the color of a winter morning sky when the clouds had cleared. Clara had stood at the kitchen door, holding the fabric, and looked at Eleanor, and not been able to say anything for a moment. "Oh, stop," Eleanor had said with a briskness that was very fond. "Just make the dress." Clara made the dress. She wore it on Saturday, and Nathan looked at her when she came into the room, and his face did the thing it had been doing for months, but fully now without any of the reserve, and she held his gaze and let herself be seen. The ceremony was short. Nathan said what he meant in 7 words, and Clara said what she meant in 8, and the minister said the legal part, and it was done. Emmett cheered. Hale shook Nathan's hand for a long time without letting go. Diego bowed to Clara, a small formal bow entirely genuine, and said in the most words she had ever heard him use at one time, "This ranch thanks you, Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Cole." Clara felt the name settle on her like something she had not known she was waiting for. Mrs. Cole. Not the cook, not the woman nobody in town would vouch for, not the woman who was too big, too ordinary, too much. The woman who had rebuilt a kitchen from a nearly empty pantry and 3 jars of old preserves. The woman who had fought a fraudulent land claim with public records and a letter to the county board and a dinner that fed half the valley. The woman who had found a dead garden and refused to let it stay that way. The woman who had looked at a grieving closed-off man with flour dust in the kitchen and a set of land transfer papers on the table and had decided that both of those things were worth tending. Mrs. Cole. She stood in the warm main room of the ranch house on her wedding day with her hand in Nathan's hand and looked at the people who had gathered around this place, and she felt something that she didn't try to name because some things are larger than names. That evening, after the guests had gone and the ranch had gone quiet, Clara stood in her kitchen one more time. Not her former kitchen, her kitchen, fully finally in every sense that word could carry. The dishes from the wedding supper were done. The stove was banked. The herbs hung from the rafters, and the preserved jars lined the shelves, and the cast iron pot sat on the counter where she always left it. The one thing she had carried from the road in August, the one constant through all of it, heavy and plain and entirely dependable. She put her hand on it. Nathan came in behind her. He stood in the doorway the way he always had, but it was different now. The standing. It had been different since the night they'd talked at the table, since the morning he'd come back from the hill, since the Saturday evening at the wash basin, when he'd asked her in 7 plain words to stay. "Ready to come in?" he said. Clara looked at her pot. She thought of the road in August, the heat, the 6 rejections, the 4 coins, the decision to keep walking because stopping had never once been an option she was willing to take. She thought of the wagon and the man who stopped it, and the 3 words he had offered as a condition and a test and a transaction, not knowing what he was actually offering. "You can stay." She had stayed, and in staying, she had built something that nobody could take away from her now. Not because it was protected by legal filings or community dinners, or the slow momentum of a territorial inquiry, though those things mattered, but because it was hers. In the only way that truly lasts, she had made it with her own hands, her own knowledge, her own stubborn refusal to be less than she was in a world that had spent her entire life asking her to be less. She turned around. Nathan was watching her with the open, steady look that was fully his now, no reserve, no distance, just him, exactly as he was. "Yes," she said. "Ready?" She crossed the kitchen. He reached out his hand. She took it. And Clara Whitmore. Clara Cole walked out of her kitchen with her head up and her hand held into the life she had built from nothing in the only way she had ever known how to build anything. One meal at a time. One day at a time. One person at a time, until there were enough of them to make a home. She had arrived with everything against her, and nothing in her hands but a pot and her own worth. And she had not bent, and she had not disappeared, and she had not let the world's long inventory of her supposed failures convince her that she was anything less than what she knew herself to be. A woman who could walk into a broken place and make it whole. A woman who could feed the hungry and see the unseen and hold the line when everyone around her was calculating the cost of doing so. A woman who had been told her whole life that she was too much and had spent a summer in Montana proving quietly and without fanfare that she was exactly enough. That is what Clara Cole was. That is what she had always been. And from that December evening forward, in the valley outside Red Creek, Montana, in the year of our Lord 1887, nobody who knew her doubted it for a single day.